I was looking through all your stuff, and I love seeing you playing the guitar. And I play the guitar as well. So I just, I saw you playing, look like with your grandkids or some other children. And I just thought, that's so beautiful. How long have you been playing the guitar?
Well, I guess I started in Menlo Park when I was about 14, and I'm now 58. So you do the math. It's too frightening when I do it.
Yeah. That's, I grew up playing the saxophone, and when I was in the military, it wasn't cool to sit around the fire and play the sax. And so I picked up the guitar and started strumming, and I never looked back. I've been playing since 1999. So 20 plus years, but
that's, well, it's been 44 years, I guess, for me, but there were some drier years there where I didn't pick up the guitar except for maybe once or twice a year. But the first 10 and the last 10 have been pretty full, thank God, of a lot of guitar playing. I used to write songs when I was a young man, and I kind of hadn't really gotten back to that till after hiking the trail, and then I wrote a song or two there on the trail, and then I guess having the grandchildren definitely has brought it back up again, playing the songs I used to play as a camp counselor literally 40 years ago when I was 18. Crazy.
Outstanding. Are any of the songs that you wrote on the trail, have you recorded and posted any of that to social media?
No, because I do have, I think there's one of the videos that's posted, but it wasn't really good enough. Let's put it that way, to feel comfortable about posting on the social media. But I share it with friends occasionally if they ask. Beautiful.
Well, if you feel inclined to share after our conversation today, I'd be honored to hear. I love fellow singer-songwriters flowing from the heart. That's it. That's God's inspiration through us. So, Aryeh Green, author of the My Israeli Trail, thank you so much for joining me here for another episode of the Soul Path podcast. It's going to be an exciting adventure to hear from you the lessons that you learned and the wisdom you've gained from life experience. But I'd like to just start the conversation with an icebreaker by throwing a few sentences at you, asking you to complete. Life is, people are, I am. Take it away.
With no warning, too. Life is full of wonder and blessing. People are, in essence, good, even if it takes them a while to discover the good in themselves. And I am a dreamer, a prayer, a lover, a husband, a father, a grandfather, an Israeli, an American, a songwriter, a singer, and a grandfather. Did I mention that?
Makes my heart full to hear you say those, to share all of those labels of the who am I. We take on so many different roles at different stages in our life, and yet there's that consistent core of who we are. I consider to be the soul of who we are, our spiritual identity. That life is full of wonder is a really beautiful way to describe, I think, just the awe that comes from being present and being connected with the world around us, being aware of the world around us. So in your journey on the My Israel Trail, I want to get to that, but I want to start a little bit further back. If you could share a little bit of your life story, as much or as little as you'd like, kind of from the beginning to what led you to the trail.
Oh, wow. Well, do we have 6 or 7 hours?
Well, and a couple bottles of wine.
Well, I have a bottle of wine right here if you'd like. This is my own private label. I don't know if you read that, but I grow grapes and make wine. So funny you should mention a bottle of wine. I'll try and condense it into 30 or 40 seconds. But I was born in America I'm actually a direct descendant of one of the first Jewish families that came to North America. My family's been in North America since 1690, and I'm a direct descendant of the first leader of the Jews as a people in North America. And I grew up in California and Washington, D.C. with a very strong sense of both Jewish identity as a member of the Jewish people and also as an American, as an inheritor of this great American identity. And I actually ended up coming to Israel to study to be a rabbi. And in the end, I stayed in Israel, decided not to be a rabbi. I became more religiously observant. You may know that Judaism is more of a civilization, a combination of a peoplehood, a national identity, as well as religious faith community and cultural and linguistic inheritance, kind of more like a family than a religion, as it were. But I ended up deciding not to be a rabbi. I became more observant on the religious side and decided to throw my lot in with this wonderful experience of our return to our sovereignty and our ancestral homeland for the first time in 2,000 years. And that's what brought me to Israel. But the short version of the rest of the story is I was married. And then after about 30 years, my wife decided that she'd rather be on her own. And so I went through a very painful, really devastating divorce that was not my choice. It was not something I had sought for or sought after. And although I recognized, of course, intellectually her right as an adult human being to make a decision that she felt was right for her, it was definitely not something that I was either looking for or really capable of digesting. And so for me, that really turned my world upside down. And so between the pain and the suffering, the anger, the frustration, the resentment that was involved with that, I ended up taking time off of work and spent 2 months, 48 days, because I don't hike on the Jewish Sabbath, 8 weeks of hiking 6 days a week, 800 miles up and down the length and the breadth of the land of Israel, all alone. It was a solo hike and nonstop with a 50-pound pack on my back at age 51. And it was quite an experience. Really, it did achieve what I was looking for, which was to help me to find healing and to be ready to move on with my life. And that's the story of what brought me to the Israel Trail. There's certainly more background I can share with you.
Oh, absolutely. It's a remarkable feat for anyone to strap on a pack, to hike that long, let alone a 50-pound pack at 50 years old, and taking that up. You had done some hiking, as I understand it, but nothing quite like that. And so the breadth of that undertaking was incalculable, right? You couldn't know in advance what you were getting yourself into. But I want to back up for just a second. When you describe life is full of wonder, did you see that a lot in your upbringing? What are some of the early memories you have of the wonder of life?
Well, I think that to a certain extent, the answer would be no and yes. No, in the sense that my parents, with great respect and affection and love for them, are not, they're both, thank God, still alive at 89, the most spiritual or religiously focused of people. So we didn't talk a lot about gratitude or wonder or blessings when I was growing up. My mother perhaps was a little bit more spiritually oriented than my father, but I had a number of different, I would say, formative experiences within the context of growing up, one of which was at age 12 or so, 7th grade, actually taking a class. It's so funny, Luke, and I don't believe in coincidences. The name of this class, funny in terms of the way you started our interview, the name of this class was Who Am I? And that class was instrumental in guiding me towards being a camp counselor and how I functioned as a camp counselor, reading a book called How to Talk So Kids Will Listen, How to Listen So Kids Will Talk, which you may be familiar with. And then studying psychology at UC Berkeley and being a psych major. Even going into international relations with my master's in international relations was related to the question of how we interact at that level, on the national level, as opposed to interpersonal. But that was formative, and there was no question that there was a lot of discussion there of appreciating our blessings. But more than that, as a camper at summer camp, Sky Lake Yosemite Camp outside of Yosemite in the high Sierras in California, I had a camp counselor named Robert, who was otherwise known as the Wombat. He was from Australia, and he was instrumental for me as somebody who really celebrated life, who really just enjoyed and took life to its fullest. And so those were, I would say, the first steps towards that sort of an approach to the wonder of the universe, let alone the blessings that we have as individuals. But I think the other answer would be that coming to Israel and deciding to live here in Israel and to throw, as I said, to throw my lot in with this wonderful experience in our religious sovereignty here, and becoming religiously observant, I became much more focused on, not just aware of, but purposely focused on appreciating the miracles of my life personally and our national life, our communal life. And so that I think has carried through the last 36 years that I've lived here, 37 now.
What age were you when you moved to Israel?
21, just ready to become, finish my bachelor's, ready to study to become a rabbi.
So it's fascinating to me that you were studying at UC Berkeley, you were studying psychology, and then you transitioned toward pursuing the path of a rabbi and becoming a religious practitioner at that point. And it would almost seem like, I guess, the assumption would be that somebody that studied, psychology at UC Berkeley might be open spiritually, but probably would not later then pursue religious practice. And so I'm curious, in that time of study and psychology, was there something that sparked your spiritual interest, your curiosity? How did you come from that point to being passionate and pursuing the religious path?
Well, all of these things I think are interconnected, as of course I'm sure you'd agree. In my formative years as a teenager, I was seeking out spirituality. I would go with friends to church, to synagogue, to youth groups, looking for the answers to some of the biggest questions that we all ask. Perhaps I might have just been a little bit ahead of the curve at 14, 15, 16 instead of waiting until 18 to 20 or what have you. But I was looking for some answers, and I had a number of, I think, important experiences with a number of very good, down-to-earth and sensitive spiritual leaders, pastors, rabbis, and others, who encouraged me to continue to explore without trying to coerce me in one or another specific directions. When I got to UC Berkeley, I was already, I would call it, within the context, if you're familiar at all with the different streams of Judaism. It doesn't matter because it's true for any spiritual, I think, faith community. There are those who are more or less involved in the ritual aspects. And I kind of adopted a number of ritual aspects of Judaism, which meant something to me. So for instance, I would get on my motorcycle and go to the top of a hill somewhere and play the guitar, if we were talking about guitar earlier, to sing in the Sabbath day on a Friday night. I would light candles, 2 candles, which is the traditional religious way of bringing in the Sabbath on a Friday night. But then when I was at Berkeley, Berkeley doesn't have minors, but just as a kind of a shorthand, you might say I minored in religious studies, because I did take a number of courses in comparative religion, Gandhian methods of conflict resolution. Great other example, because it's connecting religiosity, spirituality, my eventual move into international relations, and the psychological elements of conflict resolution. So that was, you may know, because you're in Seattle, that Berkeley has a certain spiritual element, not just on Telegraph Avenue with the crazies running around and talking to themselves. But there's the graduate union, the graduate theological union is based in Berkeley. There are a number of other spiritual movements, and I spent a lot of time doing Zen sitting and exploring Sikh temples and going to. I had an Episcopalian girlfriend. We used to go to Friday night services in my synagogue in San Francisco with my grandmother, and then Sunday evening vespers or services at her Episcopalian church there in Berkeley. So I was doing a lot of that, and it did connect to the study of psychology, because the studies that I were doing were really focused less on the analytical side or on the research side, and more on the cognitive, behavioral, and affective side, looking at our feelings, looking at what it is that gives our life meaning. And so it is connected more than you might think. My pursuit was not an academic pursuit of psychology as much as it was an interest in people and in trying to find answers, or even if you don't find the answers, trying to experience the process of looking for the answers to those big questions of the universe.
That's awesome. Yeah, I see the two, psychology and spirituality, as perfectly blended, just as much as mathematics and philosophy are perfectly blended. They're intricately woven together. And I don't believe that we can study the human mind or human behavior without encountering the spiritual experience that's shared across the spectrum of humanity, all the different traditions passed down through the ages. It is precisely to make sense of life, to give life meaning, to the origin story. Where do we come from? What happens life after death and all of that? And it's really, I think, a special path when you have the opportunity. You're not necessarily raised in a dogmatic home, so it's not a heavy indoctrination, if you will, and you're free to be curious and explore, and then find that path that ultimately, in my words, would be to find the path that feeds the soul. And so when you were experiencing services at the Episcopal Church, I would imagine you might have had, some fellowship there, some rich spiritual experience, or at a synagogue, or in these different areas. Do any of those experiences stand out to you as maybe one of the first times you really felt the presence of God or a divine connection of some sort?
Well, I would say that it's an interesting aspect of my life. When I was writing my book, I had to choose the language that I was using very carefully, because I started writing about how I discovered, for instance, just kind of an amazement at natural phenomena. And one of my children, adult children, said to me, "Daddy, that you can't say that. You've always been, one to take us out on the balcony and say, 'Come look at this sunset with me. It's phenomenal.'" So I really have had that wonder, as it were, of nature and connection with the universe. I may not have connected it growing up with a concept of God as creator, or as all powerful, or omniscient, or what have you. But there was I think, a transformational experience that I don't mention in the book that I talk about. Actually, maybe I do. It's been a while since I wrote the book. I don't know what I did or didn't include in it. But I wrote in my journal as I was traveling through Europe, after I spent a semester at the University of Surrey in England, and I was making my way to Israel to start my rabbinical program. I had a number of different experiences. I won't go into them now, but this is what sparked my interest in more traditional, what I'll call normative Jewish practice and philosophy. But I had a number of different experiences, one of which was sitting in and around the foothills of Mount Olympus, in Greece, in the Peloponnese islands of Greece. And there I was sitting next to a stream that was apparently where Persephone there was some mythological Greek story there that spoke to me. And at that point, I did have something of an epiphany, which is not in answer to your question where I saw God or experienced God, but the epiphany that I had was I had been struggling. Remember that I'm on my way from Europe to Jerusalem to study to be a rabbi, but I didn't believe in God. And that dichotomy, that dilemma really bothered me. How can I become a rabbi if I don't believe in God? That doesn't make a lot of sense. So it was sitting on the side of that stream that I suddenly had this epiphany where I said to myself, you know what, it doesn't matter. I believe in a transcendental force. And this is before Star Wars, by the way. A transcendental force which powers the universe, which I can't say I came to this on my own volition. I'd read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle. In the course of my travels through Europe, I had read numerous books on Judaism, Christianity, what have you, in those formative years between age, say, 14, 15 till this point, age 21. But I can't identify precisely where this set of ideas came from. It was a combination, an assortment of kind of all that I had read until then. But I simply decided that there is, and I believe in, some unifying force in the universe. There is some greater good or goodness that we're all part of. There is definitely some sense of creation and creator that binds us together as humanity and binds us with the rest of the universe. And that epiphany for me enabled me to come to Israel and study to be a rabbi for the first year before I dropped out of the rabbinical school, without actually addressing directly or feeling the need to come to terms with or find an answer to the fact that I didn't believe in God, because it just changed my definition of God. It enabled me to be a much more open, accepting view of what do we mean when we say God, as opposed to thinking of, an old man with a big beard who, controls everything we do or created the universe.
All right. That is a really key. Well, you said epiphany. I agree with that word. That insight, that awakening, if you will, to that presence. I define God this way. I mean, we define God differently, I think, in different stages of life. But God, good old divinity, G-O-D, good old divinity. Life is fundamentally good because all we really have to do is eat, sleep, and procreate. And those are all pretty enjoyable experiences, but there is this divine essence. There is an eternal enigma. There is an intelligent existence. There is something that animates the cosmos, and we are part of that. We are expressions of that. And, if you were studying traditional scripture, it would say that, God is in us. We are expressions of God, are children of God, different sectors of spirituality have different beliefs about it, but ultimately it is the unifying force. I think those were great words. How has your understanding of God from that epiphany point to coming through your journey, on your time on the trail, has your definition of God, understanding of God changed? And if so, can you describe that transition or change?
Well, it's less to do with the trail than it has to do with the transition that I went through in those first few years in Israel. I became more religiously observant, what could be called today, if you have to put me in a box, which I don't normally do. I became orthodox in my observance. Meaning I keep the Sabbath, Shabbat. I keep kosher, the laws of kashrut, and other elements of being a normative or traditional Jew in terms of my religious or ritual behavior. I was able to do that because I recognized the full beauty of the puzzle, as it were, in those first years of my becoming more interested in our traditional observance. Again, I kind of alleviated the need, or I released myself from the demand that I had to have answers for everything. If there were a few pieces of the puzzle that still confused me, or that I wasn't 100% certain of, what I recognized was, if you look at 1,000-piece puzzle, it's a beautiful mosaic. It's a beautiful painting, even if one or two of the pieces are a little bit blurry. And so I didn't really have to fight that, but I did come to an acceptance through a number of different books I read, classes I took, conversations I had over those first years. I did come to an acceptance of the basic concept of God as creator. Science, I'm sure you've read more books than I have, as have our listeners or our viewers, on proofs of God's existence. The Jewish people's continued existence is one of the best, if more enjoyable, or kind of maybe ironic and playful proofs that God exists. If God didn't exist, I think the Jews might have faded away from the stage of history many, many years ago. But to be less plainful, the issue of the creation of the universe, the complexity of the human anatomy, the beauty and wonder that we've been talking about, I did accept the basic reality of God, of a being that was responsible for the goodness of nature that we experience and for the blessings in our life, and what have you. So it wasn't so much the trail as it was the process that I underwent there in those years. Hiking on the trail, and this goes back to what I was saying about my children helping me to, and my wife helping me to choose better language. The trail reinforced for me all of these elements. I speak in my book about the element of gratitude, the element of humility, and the element of acceptance, that we're not in charge of the world. Who's in charge? God's in charge. And that's such a liberating concept. Yeah. I can't change everything. I can make my effort to do what I can do, but like that old pithy aphorism about I think it's called the serenity prayer, to accept the things that I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference between those I can and that I can't. Yeah. All of that was tied up in my understanding of God's existence and my relationship with God, and God's relationship with us humanity, as well as, of course, with us as the Jewish people.
Beautiful. A couple of things that stood out to me there in that share was the playful. You are being playful with what could be interpreted as a painful history for the Jewish people. And then also in personal life, we go through tragedy, tribulation, and then if we can be playful with that in our mind, be curious, I think that it helps a lot toward healing. And then the thing that really stood out, I wrote down, was releasing the need for answers. We can't always make sense of it at the cognitive level. We can't always put language to it that somehow soothes it. That has to happen at a deeper level, at a spiritual level, for deeper healing. Right. That's been my personal experience. And I love backpacking myself. I grew up in the Alaskan wilderness without running water and electricity. And so there are many times in my childhood, which was not a basket of roses. It was a rough upbringing, but I would go out and just be alone in nature. And there were times when I'd stand someplace and feel like I might be the first human being that's ever stood right here and looked at that swamp. And there was something that resonated with me in your book about feeling small, and yet there's a magic that abounds in that moment, feeling that connection with everything that is, with, I would call it the divine connection. My connection with God started in those moments. And I wasn't raised religious. I did become, I've been Pastor Luke. I was very involved in religious ritual and that for a period of time in my 20s, and have, since then moved into different expressions, exploring different paths of spiritual journey. But I come back to every year going on a solo backpacking trip, and I say to seek wisdom in solitude, to get out of my head and into my heart, so that I can listen, I can hear at a deeper level than just the mental chatter. And it takes time on the trail, days or even weeks. And I think that might be an appropriate transition point into the My Israel Trail, that journey. You opened up the first chapter, the title was Humility. And humility, that if there is nothing else that a person learns when you're in the backcountry or you strap on a pack and you go out and encounter the elements, it's humility, right? Can you describe for me your experience those first few days, that taste of humility? What was that like for you?
I love your perspective, and the fact that you've done also the kind of wilderness trekking that deepens that or introduces you to that feeling, because yes, there's no question. And I have to say, Pastor, look, this is one of the things I speak a lot in synagogue, sometimes in churches as well. And one of the things that I love is to talk about the desert experience. And sometimes, in fact, I would say often, I won't do it now because this as a recorded both video and audio, it doesn't quite work in this kind of a context. But when you're with, even on a video or audio, you're with a crowd of other people, it doesn't matter whether it's 500 or 50 or 10. Sometimes I just stop, like I did here, but I let the silence rest for 30 seconds. Now, I mean, we're not going to do that here because you can't just have silence for 30 seconds. But if those listening or watching here can try it and think, even if you press pause and wait for 30 seconds, I think all of us are astounded at how long 30 seconds of silence feels. And I do that, and it's almost became a meditative practice for me, walking minute after minute, step after step, hour after hour in the desert, in the silence of the desert. I like for people to get at least a little bit of a taste of how overwhelming that is. In one sense, frightening in its overwhelming nature. On the other hand, it brings out this sense of humility, this sense of a vast universe that we are simply a very, very small part of. And the humility that connects, at least the lesson that I learned, other people, I'm sure, learn other lessons from that kind of silence in the desert. But for me, those first few days and literally 10 hours of walking in silence all alone, surrounded by desert hills and valleys and dry mountain, dry creek beds and what have you. For me, it was, I used the word already once, the word liberating. It was so refreshing to have the silence after years in the process of this divorce, years of talking with therapists and with my former wife, and with friends and with family, and talk and analyzing, and the experience of just being alone with her thoughts. I had a friend who's a therapist, a psychoanalyst, in fact. When I sent him a picture of me sitting cross-legged on the top of a mountain cliff, saying, "Here, I did a bit of meditating and I decided to take a selfie," he wrote back and he said, "Aryeh, this whole trek is just one long meditation." And there's a lot of truth to that. I want to share with you, Pastor Luke, just an interesting kind of perspective on this from our tradition. There's a phrase or a story in the Gemara, in the Talmud, from about 2,000 years ago, which is also repeated by a Renaissance era rabbi, where there was a sage in the Talmud who carried 2 scraps of parchment, one in each pocket. One was a quote from Genesis that humanity is created in the image of God. And the other from also Genesis, that we were created from the dust of the earth. And this balance between I am a holy emanation of the universe, of the all-powerful, of the beauty and wisdom of God, and on the other hand, I'm nothing but a speck of dust. This balance, it's not a dichotomy. What's important from our tradition is that we have to recognize both elements in our own identity. We have to treat ourselves and other human beings as representatives of, and in fact, as emanations of God, with all the respect and admiration and gentleness that requires. But at the same time, we have to recognize that we are not the center of the universe. And that's the humility part of it. And it made a big difference for me in the beginning of my path towards healing, of recognizing that even though my pain and suffering were deep and I had to deal with that, that it's not all about me.
Wow. That depth of knowing, or coming to that place deep inside where you realize it's not about me. And I love that story, to have both in the pocket, so to speak, not the dichotomy. Really, it's the duality. It's both. It's the material and the magical, the metaphysical. It's the density of our bones and our flesh, and at the same time, it's the spark of pure energetic awareness that is our spirit, our soul. All of this at all times. And when we can elevate our awareness and come into this, I call it a kind of a spiritual state of mind, if you will, but in that place where we can be observing life as it is, not just through our filters and our perceptions, but just taking it in. I think that that's something that's uniquely afforded by solitude in nature, or being alone in nature, or just being close to nature. But when we're in that place, we realize how wondrous, how magnificent nature is, and then how truly small we are. That is, there's something super special about that to me. I'm curious if had you experienced anything like that prior to being on this journey, on this trek?
No.
Okay.
Really not. And that's one of the reasons why it was, I was not somebody who necessarily, I did a lot of meditating in college. I mentioned Zen sitting, what have you. And as part of my religious practice, I had occasionally had cause to do some meditation. Certainly in the course of the lead up to the divorce, I did a lot more. I went on some silent meditation retreats, what have you. But I had never been somebody who was really interested in the desert. I found the desert just much less pleasurable and certainly less awe-inspiring than the forests of Northern California or Northern Israel. And so it was something that I basically had avoided for the 36 or 30 years at that time that I lived here in Israel. So it was very, very new for me. And that's one of the reasons when people ask me about hiking the trail, I often recommend starting there in the desert in the south and making the way north, rather than, it is possible to do it in the other direction. But I found it much more both meaningful and uplifting to move from the starkness and silence of the desert to the vibrant and fertile forests and greenery of the north and the coast. So it was definitely something that was new to me.
The desert it can be a really powerful metaphor, right? The desert, we might be in a desert period of life, or to be, the Jewish traditional history, the stories of being in the desert for 40 years, right? But to be in the desert in the metaphor context, it seems to be desolate. It seems to be dry. And that implies a thirst, an innate thirst, that we're seeking some source of nourishment ultimately, but, looking for that which gives life in an area that doesn't seem like there's a lot of life. It's just scorched earth. What is out here? My experience in hiking through the desert, and I've done a lot of backpacking in the deserts of Utah, Arizona, and that area, region of the US, the desert comes to life. When I went into the desert at first, hiking in a forest, you're overwhelmed by the life. But when you walk into the desert, you see rocks and this and that. And a poem came to me when I was hiking through the desert one time. I was just taking it in. Transient time, layers of change, create and destroy two sides of the same. Transient time, layers of change, create and destroy two sides of the same. In the book, you had mentioned, just observing the rocks, and there's, 50 million years ago, this one jetted up, and then this one over here is stratified by a million years. Transient layers of change. It puts it into context, and realizing the timelessness of creation from the source to the sum of all. That really helps me kind of orient myself or situate myself into what's real right now. What's real? Are my problems real? Are my realities real? Are all these thoughts real? Or is there something deeper, that deeper knowing that I was alluding to earlier? In your time in the desert, as you transition, as I understand, you're traveling north toward the more fertile and lush northern forests of Israel. Was there a metaphoric transition with that as you were moving through the desert toward the more lush? What was that like? I guess does your journey resonate with that metaphor of the desert?
Oh, very much so. And in fact, the next chapter, the first two chapters are about desert humility, but the next chapter is part of that transition of still in the desert with a sense of acceptance that we were talking about before, but then transitioning into the hills around Jerusalem, which is in fact where my home and family is and was the transition from that humility and acceptance of this is the situation I'm in, I'm divorced, I can't change that, to this sense of gratitude. And I remember crying, I describe it in the book, crying on seeing the first colorful flower after 3 weeks of the browns and grays and blacks and yellows of the desert, coming across a colorful flower and being so grateful, so appreciative of the color itself and the life that it represented. So it was much more than a metaphor. It was real. The transition from humility and acceptance to gratitude was very much part of the physical hike. And only then after that, in other words, the physical appreciation of the greenery of the first forest that I walked through. Not to mention, by the way, the approaching of areas that I was much more familiar with in the hills around my hometown of Beit Shemesh near Jerusalem. So there were all sorts of elements that were related directly to the trail and the hike itself, which then, of course, allowed me to apply to the wider issue of the gratitude that I had towards my friends and family who'd been so supportive of me in the process of the divorce, let alone in the lead up to the hike and supporting the effort of the hike itself. Full of appreciation for my parents, my brother, my closest friends, my kids, of course. To even just the gratitude to have the privilege of hiking the trail, because not everybody can do that, take 2 months off of work. And I even ended up feeling, I talk about this a bit in the book, a sense of gratitude towards my former wife. If she hadn't wanted to divorce me, I would have never had the experience of having this transformative solo hike on the trail. I could have done without the 50-pound pack on my back, but I was definitely grateful, but actually less playfully, also very full of appreciation for the wonderful life that we had shared and built, the beautiful children that we had together, the communities that we had helped to start and build, and really what I call, there's a Hebrew phrase that doesn't translate so well into English, but as a pastor, you'll understand it. The turn of phrase, we built a faith-based home in Israel. And that concept in the Hebrew talks about not just a physical home, but a universe, as it were, of a family that we created based on our shared faith, our shared both national and tribal and peoplehood identity, and shared culture and language, and giving birth and raising our children in our ancestral homeland was just really literally a miracle, something that I was incredibly grateful for, and that definitely accompanied me in that middle section of the hike.
Let's talk about this a little bit. The humility, acceptance, and gratitude, those like connecting dots on the trail are almost like milestones or cairns, if you're familiar with that term.
Sure.
Pointing the way. And I just want to back up on the pastor thing for just a second. I'm not Pastor Luke now. I don't subscribe to any traditional religion per se. Hence the Soul Path podcast, opening up the journey for other people. I still care about nourishing spiritual growth and all of that. But I was pastor, and I was working in Sacramento, California at a non-denominational congregation. I had been invited. I had been living in Hawaii. Somebody came and saw me speaking and preaching and said, "Oh, wow, we'd love you to come to California and do this thing and light the fire here, spread it, let it grow." Yeah. And so I did. I took that, which was a significant decrease from, I had built up a business in Hawaii and was successful. I told my wife, "I'm giving away the business. I'm taking the high road and I'm going into full-time ministry." And so I went to California with that mission. And I was there working in the church, doing the good work and all of that stuff. And my wife went into a health crisis, and there became this pull in my heart to take care of her where she was at, and then also to shepherd the flock. And the leader of the denomination was telling me, "Your calling is to be here shepherding the flock." And I'm saying, in my heart, I feel like my mission is to be serving my wife over here. And that was kind of the split of the tear between the church. And I went through a period of time watching the woman that I love be destroyed, ultimately, psychologically destroyed might be a way of looking at it. And when we went through divorce, she decided to take a different path in life, and it ripped my heart out. I didn't understand. I had been praying and fasting, and I had believed that God had brought us into this union. The two had become one flesh, and all of this stuff. Ultimately, to watch her walk out the door and be at a loss, there was nothing that I could do, no amount of love that would bring her back, and all I could do was ultimately accept that. But I wasn't ready to accept that at that point in time. So I went into a period, I called it back into the wilderness, or perhaps back into the desert, where I was, fighting against God. I was actively questioning and challenging a belief system that I had adopted in good faith, though intellectually I had some questions about it. But ultimately I just said, "You know what, I'm done with all this crap." And I went into the desert for a period of time. And it wasn't until years later that I was studying the Yoga Sutras. See, I had broken my body in the military. I had 3 surgeries on my ankle, 2 on my knees. I dealt with a decade of chronic pain, and the Veterans Affairs, the VA, was going to amputate my foot. And somebody said, "Hey, you should check out yoga." I was in a lot of pain. And so I got into yoga. And I'm an all or nothing guy, so I was all in, and I was really studying yoga. I was studying the Yoga Sutras, and I come across this passage in the Yoga Sutras that says, self-study, self-discipline, and surrender to God. This is the heart of a yogi. And I thought, self-study, yes. I mean, I am avidly, self-study, self-reflection my whole life. Self-discipline, got it in spades. But surrender to God, what the hell does that mean? And I had to chew on that for a long time. What does it mean, surrender to God? And at one point, sitting and staring into a fire one night, it hit me like a bolt of lightning, zinging out from my heart, every trial, tribulation, every painful moment, including the divorce and other things that I went through, connected if it wasn't for those things, I wouldn't be where I was at now with the woman that I love, the child that I love, the family that I love. And in that, it broke me. It broke my rebellion, my resistance, and it just gushed gratitude. I could finally accept that it had to be the way that it was. I don't have to understand it. I can release my need to understand and just accept it. And with that context, or with that story, that opened up my heart in a big way to having a relationship with God in a way that kind of skipped past my head. You know what I mean? It was more a heart level acceptance. And with that in mind, I'm curious, your pain, your journey, your struggle, you're in the desert, you're moving, you see the flower, and there's gratitude in that, gratitude for familiarity and all of the things that you had been through at that point in time. Can you speak a little more to the acceptance aspect of it? Where was that transition? How was there a moment that all of a sudden it clicked? Please share.
Yes. Yeah, there definitely was. And in fact, look, I'm astounded at how similar our experiences seem to have been with regard to loss of love, divorce, and then getting out into nature, and then finding love again, which that kind of, it's a spoiler alert, I suppose. But that is also how my story has wound up as well. But that issue of acceptance was very explicitly provoked by a specific experience. I was hiking out, and we're talking about the first day of the hike. There's a small book called the Red Book, which is kind of the informal, unofficial, but authoritative guide to hiking the Israel Trail. And in it, the author of the book, who I've had cause then also towards the end of the trail and afterwards to both speak, meet, argue with, and give some feedback to, suggests, if you have some extra time, you've got to climb this mountain because the views are breathtaking. Now, the book is in Hebrew, and my Hebrew is relatively is fluent. I'm a fluent Hebrew speaker. I've been here for 37 years. But as I'm sure you can imagine, and most people understand about language acquisition, there are certain vocabularies which are general, where you can be fluent in a language, but not necessarily know all the words for, let's say, car repair and specific tools for spark plugs. Most of us, I don't know that word in Hebrew. Actually, I do now because I've had enough cars. But you get my point. There are specific vocabularies for specific endeavors. So there was a word in his description about taking this little extra trail to see this breathtaking view, if you can possibly do so, that my eyes kind of just skipped over because I didn't know the word. So, you get the meaning of the sentence, even if you don't know the word. Well, that word happened to be, in translation to English, happened to be steep. In fact, very steep is the accurate translation of that word. So I found myself on the side of a cliff with this 50-pound pack on my back. The first day out, it's hot, and we're getting towards nighttime. Nightfall is coming, and I have gone up on this tangential path, and I'm literally scrambling hand over fist up boulders that are as big as I am on a very, very steep ascent. And I sat down. It's about an hour and a half before sunset, and I basically started to despair. I took out my phone. I was going to try and call my son, ask him to call out the search and rescue unit of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. Come take me off this mountain with a helicopter. What am I doing here? And I really was in despair because I was afraid. I was frightened of not getting to the night camp by nightfall. Don't have enough water. That's the night camp is where I had planted some water, hidden some water behind a rock by a tree where I planned to reach that night. And the point is that I sat down and I took, you've heard of Thomas Crumb's book, 3 Deep Breaths? Wonderful book. I can highly recommend. And as the title implies, it's about taking 3 deep breaths, but with specific intentions of an understanding. The first breath is to calm yourself down and to center yourself. And the second breath is to allow yourself to see the possibilities that are before you. In any case, I took a few deep breaths, And I said to myself, Aryeh, get a grip. You're on the side of a mountain. You've got a 50-pound pack here. You have to get to your night camp. And you made a mistake. So you have to accept that. It's nobody else's fault. And nobody's going to get you out of this. This is your reality. What you have to do now is make a good decision to figure out where you're going to go from here. Are you going to go back down? Are you going to continue on? Are you going to find another path? And that acceptance for me was crucial at that very specific physical moment of taking myself in hand and accepting this reality that I had created or that had occurred. And I did make it in the end, finding the right path, getting to the night camp after dusk, but before nightfall. And I wrote in my journal that night how applicable it is to the situation that I found myself in, having just been divorced. It's only a few weeks out after the divorce that I was out on the trail. And as somebody who believed in love and loved forevermore and till death we part, or however you want to look at it, as you were saying, I never expected to find myself divorced. I have nothing against, of course. There are many relationships that reach an end and ought to be, dissolved or broken up. That was not how I felt about mine, nor about myself as a person. I felt that marriage was something worth struggling for, fighting for, making every effort to keep alive. So I sat in my tent and I wrote about the same acceptance I had on the side of that hill. Was something that I would have to adopt, to recognize, listen, you're divorced. That's your reality. You're going to have to deal with that. And that was, literally the first step in my healing was that very acceptance.
Accepting reality. And you had shared the reality that you created. You got yourself into that position, climbing up the hill, kind of glazing over the word steep, not quite picking up on the language on that one, and the whole bit. And then here you are. And what are you going to do? The choice to go up, to go back, all that kind of stuff. That is, I think, absolutely relative to every human being at some point in life. And really, it could be a daily realization that daily we find ourselves in circumstance. We have multiple choices. We can choose this path, that direction, this action. And how do we get centered enough to make a decision that we know we're making from our inner knowing or from the heart level? Not just what I think, but where my intuition perhaps leads. I'm curious, in that moment on the mountain, was there any element of intuition, or was it just a going for it? You know what I mean? Like, did you feel, I guess one example would be like you're sitting on the side of the mountain and then you get the burning bush, right? Like, go this direction. Another example might just be that you're there and you just feel like, you know what? I've been here long enough. I have peace about going in this direction. I'm going to go in that direction. Can you describe that decision making for you in that moment of acceptance? How did you go from surrender and acceptance to taking action and moving forward?
Well, I think for me, it was really a coming together of all these different elements towards the end of the trip. It's interesting you use the term taking action, because one of the books that were very instrumental for me in my development of kind of a life philosophy, but certainly in the healing from the divorce, because I reread the book, is a book called Man's Search for Meaning. It's such a powerful exploration of the importance of having a sense of purpose in life, which was born out of actually the author's experiences in the Holocaust, in the camps in Auschwitz. He developed a whole school of psychotherapy, and maybe familiar, logotherapy, which is focused on having a desire to live. The people who had a reason to live were more likely to survive the death camps, the concentration camps, which is obviously a heavy and very involved topic. But for our purposes, the main message was something that had always resonated with me. But in the last couple of weeks of the trail, as I was, as you said, processing the issues of acceptance, humility, gratitude, and we haven't really talked about the importance of forgiveness in my situation, forgiving my wife, forgiving God, forgiving myself for the pain that I was going through. But the issue of a sense of purpose, of having a goal, was something that accompanied me all through the trek. I mean, every day I had a goal to get to the night camp that night. I obviously had set myself a goal to hike the length of the trail itself, but I, of course, had the really more overarching goal of getting my life back on track, as it were. And so that last 2 weeks on the trail really did bring all of these things together within the context of recognizing that I needed to set new goals for myself, personal, professional, relationship, love related, my children, what have you, in order to allow the healing that I'd experienced to inform my next steps. And as you say, to turn the emotional growth, the personal development into real action.
Yeah, that's it. It is. We can't just be stuck. We have to accept and then move forward or move through it. And what can we learn from it and all of that? Which really sets me up for a final question. But as we're coming into the time here,
right, we are.
I know I feel like we could go for another hour, and so we might have to continue our conversation in another episode. But to be respectful of time today,
sure.
For anybody that is feeling drawn to you or would like to read your book, dig deeper into your journey, or connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Well, the first and best way is through the website. The book's website is www.myisraeltrail.com. The book can be found on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Book Depository, and elsewhere, and Goodreads. But I suppose the first point of contact would be the website, myisraeltrail.com.
Yeah. And I would say you might also look up Aryeh Green on LinkedIn. You have an incredible corporate resume as well. So you have a lot to offer. You bring a lot into the world. To wrap it up, kind of pitch you a final question. You've had this incredible journey, a whole life journey, really, that's culminating and unfolding in this moment. Your time on the trail, what was the big takeaway, the big wisdom? If you could just put it out there in a sentence or two and share that wisdom with the audience, what would you say from your heart to our listeners today?
I suppose the best thing that I can do, just summing up my experience to a great extent, is that the lessons that I learned, the concepts that I came to understand, which are to a certain extent part of the time-honored wisdom, and based on the works of giants, both in terms of Talmudic sages and more modern psychologists and teachers like Leo Buscaglia or others, as I mentioned, leading to these realizations of how humility and acceptance, gratitude and forgiveness, and this sense of purpose have really filled my life with a sense of meaning, and were instrumental for me to deal with the personal challenges that I was facing. And I would hope and think that anybody facing their own personal challenges or hardships could find in those 5 elements a foundation of real inner peace and a sense of harmony in facing their own challenges.
Humility, acceptance, gratitude, forgiveness, and finding purpose. That is a path for anyone to find inner peace, to find healing, to find personal growth, spiritual growth, to find a deeper connection with life, with God, with good old divinity. I received those words of wisdom, and I am grateful. I'm appreciative. Thank you, Aryeh, very much for joining me today on the Soul Path podcast. It has been an honor. It has been a joy. And I would love to have you back on to dig into a couple other aspects of the spiritual journey at some point in time. So I look forward to our continued contact. With that, from my heart to yours, I hope that you Have a peaceful day, a joyous day, or evening as it is in your time. And I'll look forward to connecting with you again soon. All right, Aryeh, have a great evening.
Thank you very much, Luke. Me too. I very much enjoyed it.